Hi. Before we get started on talking about news literacy, I wanted to read you something. This is a thing called rumor control. It was a post by Chuck Watson from Enki Research, which typically Enki Research does a lot of data crunching during storm events, hurricanes, to look at how people behave and what should be the best choices people should make based on the data available. So Chuck Watson with Enki Research posted this on April 17th to the blog that comes out of his department. One of my secondary areas of research is how information flows during a crisis. As noted previously, how people act is based on their perception of reality, not the actual state of things. And so far, modeling purposes, you have to model what people think is going on as well as what is actually going on in order to anticipate their actions. The situation in Savannah, Georgia, where I am based, is a snapshot of what is going on in communities across the nation and the world for that matter. Unfortunately, the lack of trust in institutions, especially government, and the news media has become reminiscent of the former Soviet Union, and rumors are often taken as fact. And here in Savannah, there are some pretty toxic rumors floating around, some originating in the health community. And for a variety of reasons, people started confiding in me regarding potential problems in the local healthcare system. It's hard to sort things like this out: legitimate concerns, misunderstandings, or simply grousing from the dissatisfied. Obviously, these are in one sense anecdotal, but these are concerns that are circulating in the community and are influencing perceptions and therefore actions. Obviously, the truth matters, but from my research perspective, the fact that there is a dichotomy between what institutions are saying in relationship to the provision of personal protective equipment for healthcare providers and what their employees are saying is the fact. He goes on to describe the competing narratives and then ends this way. This is not to criticize the potential whistleblowers or defend their institutions, but to try to provide a perspective and path. If you have a serious concern involving a dangerous situation, much less misconduct, please carefully document it and go through channels to make sure your concerns is not a misunderstanding. If your institution is unresponsive or you are afraid of them, please present it to the appropriate regulatory authorities, which can usually be done anonymously. And if that fails, only then go through the media and journalists, and be prepared to provide your documentation. This issue for me is that while I'm involved in the journalistic enterprise by providing supporting data and analysis to various news outlets, and this blog is technically a news outlet in and of itself, Enki does not have the resources to conduct serious investigative journalism that issues like this deserve and require to get a definitive answer. So I plan to keep out of this from here on out. My name is Amy Condon, and I am so delighted that Roger Smith and Debbie invited me to offer this course, which I hope you'll find timely and meaningful to the Learning Center. This is all about news literacy. And right there in the middle of a pandemic is a post on social media by someone who's responsibly trying to find out the reality of data that's out there. And I thought this moment, this post encapsulated what the challenges are with being even remotely news literate today. I'm a freelance journalist here in Savannah, and I knew I wanted to be a journalist, I think since I was 6 or 7. When my mom, instead of letting me watch Sesame Street, actually would sit me down before afternoon kindergarten when she had to take me, and we watched the Watergate hearings. And so I was sort of immersed in what was happening, and she would tell me what was going on and who was doing what and what the issues were. And I was fascinated. And then the following summer, my grandmother read All the President's Men to me, instead of actually reading me children's books, because I'd read all the ones that she had. And she was reading that in the afternoon. She said, "Come sit with me and I'll read you what I'm reading." And then I saw the film when it came out in 1976. And by then I was already reading the Dallas Morning News with my cereal. And I wanted to be Mary Tyler Moore and then later Lou Grant. So this is sort of part of my DNA. The enormous role and responsibility of the press and the journalists in our society is really part of who I am. And I take very seriously this unstated contract between people and the press, that our nation's citizens need a free and open press to preserve our democracy. And that's something that both parties have fallen short on the past 30 plus years. And we as a public have fallen short on. And I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say that now more than ever, we, you and I, have an enormous obligation to develop our news literacy skills. So over the next 3 weeks, we're going to do some things together. We will develop our critical thinking skills to understand truly what it means to be news literate, what constitutes news, and how to actually spot fake news, because that's sort of become a catch-all phrase. And this isn't the first time it's been used in our history. We're going to talk about that a little bit. That many times people in positions of power will call something fake if it's unfavorable, but that doesn't mean it's not based in fact. Yet at the same time, truly fake news is given a platform. So we need to be able to distinguish between those so that one, we can call that out, and two, we can amplify the voices that are voices of concern and that are based in observation, research, quotes, sources that are verifiable. We need to become the enlightened citizens that our founding fathers wanted us to be so that we can be informed voters. We can question whether or not to post something on social media and engage in those uncomfortable yet necessary discussions that we seem to be avoiding, but are necessary to put the facts and the wins in ourselves so that we can actually live up to our highest ideals. In no way is ignorance any sort of form of bliss for us. We can't be that kind of people. And this is something I feel very passionate about. I've actually been studying this for quite some time. But we're going to have to take our steps to get there. This won't be easy, and it will require more of us. And at a time when we feel like we barely have any more time to give to anything special. And with such a vast universe of media channels, blogs, magazines, newspapers, social media, I mean, like, it can get crazy. You're trying to work overtime just to sift through the enormity of information that's just coming at you from all angles. So we're going to take this one step at a time. This week, we're going to understand how we got here, why we are at this point, that there's so many factions and it's hard to know what truth is. And we're going to have to do this to better understand the actions and influences that have shaped our world and how we have more access to information but less critical understanding of the information. Next week, we'll go into discerning between slant and misinformation, because that's a big distinguishing. Some people will say something isn't valid just because it's slanted away from how they view their confirmation bias and their lens. When we do that, we diminish being able to learn and truly hear what somebody else is saying. Yet there are forces out there that are purposefully misinforming because it suits chaos, whether it suits a political agenda, whether it suits trying to undermine a person who's running for office or efforts toward jobs. And so there's a lot of things going on, and the smarter we are about it, and we can be, the smarter we are about it, the better able we are to push against it. And then in the third class, we're going to actually test our news literacy skills and learn how to spot deepfakes in photography and in video. So by the end of these 3 sessions, we should be able to come away with a deeper appreciation for the role we play in being news literate. And I hope we have a deeper sort of resolution among ourselves to support local media and to really find ways of amplifying good investigative journalism that lives up to the principles of the First Amendment. So bear with me, I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to have a little PowerPoint that can walk us through some of these things to ground us in to get us to the point where we're not just saying, okay, I'm news literate, I know how to look up sources and things like that, where we really understand our obligation in this and how it's changed over time and has brought us to this place. So hold on just a minute. All right, and here we go. News literacy. So let's go back and look at the First Amendment to the US Constitution. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. This is really critical because the framers of the Constitution so believed in the freedom of the press to the establishment of a democracy, and a thriving democracy that's supposed to be representative of the people. So back in the 1700s, what actually passed for newspapers were mostly pamphlets, and a lot of those pamphlets were political in nature, either defending or opposing England. In fact, Benjamin Franklin's brother ran a newspaper and printing press, but he was basically put out of business for his pro-revolutionary ideas. So his older brother, Ben, famous for creating Poor Richard's Almanac and being a printer unto himself, took it over. So even the concept, though, of libel was established before we were even a nation. In 1735, Peter Zenger, publisher of the New York Weekly Journal, one of these what were called penny presses at the time, which were sort of pamphlets at that time, was arrested and put on trial for allegedly printing libelous things about the British government. But his lawyer, Andrew Hamilton, argued that the articles in question could not be libelous because they were based in fact. Zenger was found not guilty, and the case established the precedent that a statement, even if negative, cannot be libelous if it is true. So if you have this standard, what's called the absence of malice, that you weren't doing anything to bring somebody down just for your own needs, but you were actually establishing something based in truth, it still could be printed, even if it was negative about the person. So it's not gossip, it's not hearsay. There's actual evidence, there's actual sourcing of it to create a standard by which it can be out there and in public. So this landmark case helped establish the foundation of the free press in our then fledgling nation. Thomas Jefferson so believed in the fundamental purpose and importance of the press along this 18th century concept that was actually started in England, that the press was the fourth estate, that informed citizens were essential to keeping the government and their representatives in check. He proposed enshrining this idea within the Bill of Rights as the First Amendment. While visiting France as a quasi-ambassador, while the Constitution was being written, he wrote back to a friend and said, were it left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without government, I should not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter. He wrote this in February of the same year that the Constitution was written and started ratification. So the very foundation of our country is in this concept that a free press is to serve the governed, not the governors. A free press is to serve the governed, not the governors. And the press's loyalties rest with its citizens. So I want you to put a pin in that idea for a bit. I want you to hold that idea there, because this is a really important ideal in the foundation of the fourth estate. So as our country grew and its citizens became more literate through education, the newspaper industry began to boom. You would see small presses coming up in neighborhoods, in cities, all throughout, and they would be passed on to people, or they would be read to people in the town square. So, but it was interesting because what passed for news then was quite different than what is considered news today. You know, something that was far more important back then were crop prices, the weather, because we were an agrarian society, labor and employment availability, the taxes, things like that, that sort of affected the daily lives of people became. But another thing that was really interesting was this concept of the penny press. So these were 1 or 2 cents. And people, and this is what sort of established the concept of the tabloid. Penny presses were great for sensationalism. They reported on crime, they reported on gossip, and they had fictional literature alongside news stories. So in England, this is how Charles Dickens got started writing. He'd serialize a novel and put it out there. And because they were paid by the word, they just kept writing and writing. Louisa May Alcott did this too. As you can see in the character of Jo in Little Women, she kept getting told by the editors to make her stories much more fantastical and much more, bloody. But along came the Associated Press in 1846. At this time, journalism isn't actually a profession. But there's the formation of the Associated Press because as cities became more industrialized and people were moving west and southwest, there was this effort among newspapers that needed to share information because what they were learning is things were affecting things that happened in Europe. Things that happened elsewhere were affecting them too, especially when it came to crop prices. And so they began sharing information. And so they created this, this association so that they could share stories. And then in 1851, the precursor to the New York Times, the New York Daily News, was founded, and it actually began setting standards for how you gather, assess, create, and present news based on accuracy, fairness, balance, and transparency. This was further advanced during the Civil War. So in the Civil War, we now have telegraph technology that allows for the transmission of articles, as well as photography. This is a Matthew Brady image of Union troops walking down Pennsylvania Avenue. And this was astounding because no longer were words devoid of images. We had these black and white images that amplified what was in the story. And we also have the invention of the inverted pyramid, which is the typical style in which news is reported. You've got a headline, a deck, and a lead, the who, what, when, and where, followed in the body where you amplify and expand on the why and the how. This was done out of war reporting. So they had to sit and watch what was happening on the battlefield and be able to report that back through a telegraph. So if anything happened in the transmission, in that very beginning, they could get the most important information up front. And if that's all you read, from the headline to the lead to just the very first part of the body, you got the gist of the story. So this is a huge advancement in news, and it also legitimized journalism in a way because it was based on real world observation. It wasn't just opinion, it wasn't just sensationalism. People wanted to know what was happening to their sons and brothers and fathers out on the battlefield. So this is the beginning and the rise of the national press. Then we had a period where we moved into what's called yellow journalism. So newspapers at this time, it wasn't advertising that was the #1 driver of their economies. It was readership. And so whatever you could do to get more readers proved that you were more successful. And this is a period in which news was sort of wagging the dog. There was this huge competition between William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, the ones who owned the biggest newspapers. Uh, and actually, we can see here is where they began leading the news and actually somewhat creating the news to their own political ends. So the Spanish-American War was the first conflict in which military action actually grew and was precipitated by media involvement, sort of stirring the pot and amplifying even sort of minor concerns into larger issues. And this created this whole sense of journalism as somewhat entertainment. This is really, you had the penny presses that sort of created the tabloid culture. Then you had some more legitimization as Associated Press and larger newspapers were being founded based on sort of these principles of fairness and accuracy and balance. But then you had this entertainment value and this political value kind of come into play. And this is really sort of the beginning of what we're seeing today, this polarization of ideas and how these polar ideas can start becoming the essence of the news rather than the news itself. And there was a real backlash to this after in the early 1900s. And thus the profession of journalism began to legitimize itself. You had who Teddy Roosevelt called the muckrakers. These were journalists who put themselves, these were like the first immersive journalists. And they developed the field of investigative journalism. Ida B. Wells was a young African-American woman and teacher in the Memphis area. And she started reporting on lynchings. And she ended up having to actually leave Memphis and go to New York because she found her own life in danger. You had Henry Demarest, who wrote for the Atlantic Monthly magazine. This is the late 1800s and the early 1900s. You saw a boom in magazines, these really great literate magazines that had news, features. This is really the development of the feature type article, which had more personality, had more storytelling techniques, but nonetheless was still based on the principles of journalism and research and observation. So Henry Demarest Lloyd wrote for the Atlantic Monthly, and he began uncovering corruption in politics and business and exposing these things in the industrial age. Nellie Bly is famous for having gone undercover and getting herself checked into a mental institution so that she could show the deplorable and horrible conditions under which people who had mental illness were being treated, and how some people were put there by their families just to take over their fortunes or to get them out of the way so that they could remarry, all kinds of things. So she uncovered this. And then Jacob Riis really focused on poverty and the state of people. And by this time, in this era, by then, 10 magazines that concentrated on investigative journalism, like Harper's, like Atlantic Monthly, they had a circulation of 3 million. So people were reading. This is how they got their information. And this type of writing and research spilled over into novels, most famously Upton Sinclair's expose of the meatpacking industry in the jungle and of the oil industry in Oil, which if you've seen There Will Be Blood, that's what it's based on. So these types of writers and these types of journalists actually led to changes in policy for better standards and regulations related to public health, poverty reduction, child labor laws, unionization, breaking up monopolies, social justice growth. And this was also the era of the growth of African-American newspapers in the Black press. One of the things, of course, and we still have this problem, is that the stories of marginalized communities were often completely left out of the narratives in newspapers because they were told through the lens of white middle-class people. Well, the Black press started interpreting things that were happening in their communities and from their lens. And because at this time you would rarely ever find a story about a lynching or the murder of a Black individual or the disappearance of a Black individual in any mainstream newspaper, and even local newspapers, because oftentimes they were controlled by the business interests in a community. But something that happens around this time is the growth of African American newspapers, and this is going to become really important later on in the mid 20th century. At this time also, in 1908, the University of Missouri actually establishes one of the first J schools or journalism schools in the entire world. And this becomes this coalescing around this idea of what a journalist is. What do journalists do? And how do they conduct themselves? And there's this concept around what is truth in journalism, because if you're writing the first draft of history, this is a phrase that Phil Graham, who became the publisher and editor of the Washington Post in the 50s, this was his concept of what a journalist did. They wrote the first draft of history, which means that if their first obligation is to the truth, what they're doing is sorting out based on eyewitness accounts, based on research, based on interviews from verifiable sources. They're sorting out what took place between the initial story and the interaction among the public, the newsmakers, and they're interpreting it. And they're pulling all of that together. And back then, there was this real effort that if you couldn't confirm something with 3 different specific sources that said the same thing, you actually couldn't use it. Remember though, they had time. They had a day or 2 or even a week to be able to ferret out a story. They didn't have the pressures of 24/7 news or being first, because they were writing to really localized audiences. Or if they were doing national stories, they had time. They weren't trying to get it on a deadline in 2 weeks. They could work 6 months on a story. They could work 3 months on a story. So reporters observe, interview, research, ask experts, gather eyewitness accounts. They do all of these things to capture moments, and then they keep adjusting and adding to as more information becomes available. So it's actually quite a bit more like science than creative writing, because they're consistently looking for something to come into the light and verifying it and share. And one of the things that they also are doing are saying who their sources are, and except in rare cases, and they're allowing readers and viewers or listeners at that time to draw their own conclusions. But there's also this give and take, because there may be somebody out there that you didn't speak with who knows something, and they can enlighten you, and that can add to the story. So there's this consistent flow between the citizenry and the journalist. The journalist is the eye and ear of the public. Remember that concept, that you're the voice for the governed, not the governors. And so there's this interesting play between these two, the citizenry and the journalist, that is consistently changing and consistently symbiotic in a lot of different ways. So we get to 1909 with the founding of the Society of Professional Journalists. This sets standards and principles for industry practice. So in 1908, we have the first journalism school in America, and in 1909, we have the Society of Professional Journalists. Now, when I was studying journalism back in the 80s, many years ago, when I joined the College Society of Professional Journalists, the college version of it, we actually took a pledge to uphold these principles. And it's not really like an oath, but you got these kind of ground into you as a journalism student that this is how you conduct yourself. So you seek truth and you report it. You're looking for those objective who, what, why, where, when, and how. And then you're trying to minimize harm. You are not out there to gotcha or bring somebody down. That wasn't your purpose. Your purpose was like, this is information everybody needs to know. And how do I do this in a way that does not hurt people, but illuminates a situation? And then how do I act independently? I am not taking money. I am not concerned with who's advertising. I'm not, these are all of the principles of professional journalists, that I am not buddy-buddy with my sources. It's been funny kind of moving in different realms as a writer and a professional journalist, a freelance journalist in a lot of ways, because you treat sources with respect, and they may be people you really like, but you also sometimes have to keep them at arm's length because you may be reporting on them. And that's the hard thing about being a citizen and a journalist, is that acting independently. So you make sure that you're not serving on boards on what you're reporting. You're not I'll never forget asking the journalist with the Miami Herald, Carl Hyacin, to write something on a report I was doing when I was working as a park planner many years ago. And he said, I believe in what you're doing, but to uphold my integrity as a journalist, I can't help you. And I hope you understand that. And I was like, I absolutely understand that. He was one of the lone voices on the environment in South Florida. So I was like, this is definitely somebody who would have the gravitas, but I absolutely understand why he said no. And that was totally appropriate. And then accountability and transparency. If you plagiarize, if you get a story wrong, if there is malice involved, you can lose your job. You shouldn't have a job if you did not follow these standards. And you're transparent. This is where I got the information. Even if you say that it is a source that has refused to be named, yet you can corroborate what that source says from other angles, then you can put that information out there. But you have to be very careful about that, because you have to be careful, transparent, and accountable. And there's very few jobs that are scrutinized like this and so public like this. So again, remember this idea that journalism is this relationship with the people, and that our first obligation is to the people, not to the people in power, but to the people who are being affected by how people wield power. So while it took 130 years to get to this point in 1909, the journalism and the press was maturing alongside the country. Remember, this was an experiment. And it still is an experiment in so many ways. And sometimes technology and sometimes things get ahead of where we are in our ability to understand and see down the road how it's going to affect us. But this becomes the underpinning of the profession. And then we move kind of into what becomes the golden age of journalism. The American Society of Newspaper Editors forms in 1922, which doesn't sound like it's just an industry thing. But what happens for the first time are editors from all over the country talking about what are the big stories in their regions. And this is how you started finding the Northern press paying attention to Jim Crow, which was not on their radar, or how you found out about famine or the Dust Bowl, or the effects of the Depression on other places. All of a sudden you had these people who were leading their newspapers and leading teams of journalists talking among one another and sharing their standards and sharing their business models, so that all of a sudden you're starting to see things that are important in New York showing up in newspapers in California, and things that are happening in the South showing up in newspapers up in the Midwest. And by this time, most major cities have morning and afternoon editions of newspapers. So people are able to get news in a much more timely fashion. Remember, there's not television at this point. There's not television news at this point. Also, at the same time, the equal time rule is established. The equal time rule specifies that radio and television, now television, but at the time, newspapers and radio and television broadcast stations must provide an equivalent opportunity to any opposing political candidates who request it. Let me be really clear, you have to request it. But this means, for example, that if a station gives a certain amount of time to a candidate during their prime hours of listenership or viewership, it must do the same for another candidate who requested it. And this is an important concept of fairness, that if we're going to present one side, we have to present the other side. This is also the same year that radio broadcast its first paid advertisement. This is a game changer because there was sponsorship. This becomes where shows are sponsored by. This is also the first true competition to newspapers and their bottom lines, because as journalism grew, so did the advertising in newspapers that helped support the printing of them. And when you were doing 2 or multiple editions of a newspaper, your printing costs were getting huge. And so they needed to offset that. Readership and subscriptions weren't going to cover all of that. Advertising did it. And here's the first thing that kind of cuts into advertising for newspapers. Also, in 1939, RCA introduced the first commercial television during the 1939 World of Tomorrow World's Fair in New York City. Again, this is a game changer. We don't know to how much, but it's definitely a game changer. And in 1949, after World War II, which was a huge golden age for newspapers and radio, this is where the first, like, truly this is where journalists showed their mettle. Walter Cronkite in the field, Edward R. Murrow standing on the ceilings, standing on the roofs of buildings in London as they're being bombed. These were guys trying to tell you what was happening in the immediacy. So radio, newspapers were delivering the information that people needed. And so after World War II, the fairness doctrine emerged, because after World War II, we started seeing communist newspapers and sort of this polarization of media again. And the polarization, because there was a Red Scare about, and there was a lot of concern about unions and race and all of these things. And so you started seeing sort of this polarization. So the Federal Communications Commission introduces in 1949 this policy that required all holders of broadcast licenses to both present controversial issues of public importance and to do so in a manner that is honest and equitable and balanced. So even if you're dealing with something, it's not about creating false equivalencies. It was acknowledging that there are opposing viewpoints on this, but it wasn't just editorializing. It was saying, here's this, but there's also this. And the fairness doctrine also gave wide latitude for how to present contrasting news. It could be done through news segments, public affairs shows, or editorials. It did not require equal time, because we already had the equal time doctrine and the equal time rule, but it did require that there be contrasting viewpoints. So I want you to remember that, because this is a really critical issue in a change that happens once television and other technology comes into play. So during this era between World War II and that really bubbled up to the forefront of the consciousness of America, 2 major story groups: the Cold War, which was fervently anti-communism, and the threat of nuclear war, and the civil rights movement. It was the movement itself and all of the events, as well as the media response to that. That in and of itself was a story. we, you know, the Cuban Missile Crisis story in 1962, it was is a classic example of the challenge with reporting. Um, the Miami News in 1962, they had a reporter named Hal Hendricks who had a really strong relationship with a lot of the CIA folks who were operating and helping to stoke the anti-Castro movement that operated out of Miami in the early 1960s, the late 1950s, early 1960s, after the 1959 revolution. And he got early wind of anti-missile and missile launch sites in Cuba that were being built in Cuba. Yet he and his editor, Bill Baggs, could not get the Kennedy administration to either confirm nor deny. And they actually printed stories in early October 1962 that started speaking about this, because this was really important to their community. And even though there was a decent relationship, there was a real effort to manage the news and when that news would come out between the Kennedy administration and the local newspapers in Miami. And they had kind of gotten burned. Those local newspapers had gotten burned pretty heavily during the Bay of Pigs, that they had reported things in a certain way that they thought that was based on rational information. They found out later that they'd been given partial information, and some of their reporters were even in harm's way. So they didn't want anything like that to happen again. Plus, they also understood what was at stake. This is possible Third World War. This is a nuclear war, and they're in the line of fire. And this is their families and their friends and the community in which they live. So 2 weeks even before the Kennedy administration went on record that these missile launch sites were being built within Cuba, the local press in Miami was reporting on it. And so you can see how that becomes such a big story, and that's the obligation of journalists, even though there could be consequences of down the line. So you've got the Cold War stories, anti-communism, nuclear war, civil rights, and the civil rights movement becomes an enormous story, as it should, but that also shows the difference in how the press approached it. We're going to take a look at those for a little bit. Edward R. Murrow, just mentioned him, about the guy standing on the roof as the Germans are bombing London, and he's reporting on it for the radio. So he emerges out of radio. He's the first radio journalist star who actually goes into this new medium of television that even in the early 1950s wasn't quite sure what it was yet. And not every household had a television, but by the end of the decade, they certainly did. And Edward R. Murrow saw the obligation of the journalist as to inform, and he felt like TV was a great medium to do that. You could reach more people, you could showcase photography and film, and it was bringing the movie, it was bringing radio, it was bringing journalism from the press, all of these things to bear. And it was one of the earliest documentary series. And it actually became the standard for 60 Minutes and almost all of the sort of news magazine type shows that we see today. And it helped define television's role in covering and analyzing news. But it also was a game changer because it showed the power of a personality to use the platform of television, either for good or ill. And so in 1954, Morrow began producing a number of episodes of See It Now that focused on the communist witch hunt of the McCarthy era. Senator Joe McCarthy and the House Un-American Activities Committee, just fueled by this anti-communism, was destroying lives and leveling accusations of communist sympathies against people from all walks of life, whether it was people involved in the civil rights movement, whether it was people who were involved in entertainment, because people saw that any tendency toward communism was undermining the US government. But what Morrow couldn't truck with was that these people were doing this without the obligations of fairness and without the obligations of due process by law. And so he would actually use recordings of McCarthy himself in action, interrogating witnesses and making speeches, and sort of brought to light and it became sort of a battle between CBS News, who was the employer of Edward R. Murrow, and Senator Joseph McCarthy. There came a point, though, where the CBS was coming down hard on McCarthy, on Morrow, saying, are you sure you're not moving into editorialization? And he came forward and he said, I've searched my conscience, and I can't for the life of me, find any justification for this. And I simply cannot accept that there are on every story two equal and logical sides to an argument. So he proceeded in covering, and he was using fact, and he was using the senator's own words. And then the senator said, I want a rebuttal. And Morrow turned over one of his entire episodes to McCarthy alone to challenge Morrow's reporting. But what it only did was solidify that Morrow had been approaching the story correctly. But this is when journalism turned far more toward activism. And while he did the equal side, it did bring down Joe McCarthy, and it also, in some sense, ended Morrow's television career, because he had been given such leeway, and he understood that he had gone into a different realm for the right reasons, but it also tipped over what journalism on television could do. In 1958, Morrow lost his show, See It Now, in 1957. And in 1958, the Radio Television Digital News Association invited him to give a speech as he got an award. And there's an award named for him now. He did a really amazing speech at this to talk about what news and television could do. And I want to share this with you. This is actually a dramatization of that very speech in the film Good Night and Good Luck. Let's see if this will work. I hope it does. And I think this is just powerful, this speech, because it really talks about, to some extent, where we are now. Let's see if it'll come up.
Of this nation, man can walk upright. No matter who he is, who she is. He began by saying that our history will be what we make it. If we go on as we are, then history will take its revenge, and retribution will not limp in catching up with us. Just once in a while, let us exalt the importance of ideas and information. Let us dream to the extent of saying that on a given Sunday night, the time normally occupied by Ed Sullivan is given over to a clinical survey on the state of American education. And a week or two later, the time normally used by Steve Allen is devoted to a thoroughgoing study of American policy in the Middle East. Would the corporate image of their respective sponsors be damaged Would the shareholders rise up in their wrath and complain? Would anything happen other than a few million people would have received a little illumination on subjects that may well determine the future of this country and therefore the future of the corporations? To those who say people wouldn't look, they wouldn't be interested, they're too complacent, indifferent, and insulated, I can only reply, there is, in one reporter's opinion, considerable evidence against that contention. But even if they are right, what have they got to lose? Because if they are right, and this instrument is good for nothing but to entertain, amuse, and insulate, then the tube is flickering now, and we will soon see that the whole struggle is lost. This instrument can teach, it can illuminate, and yes, it can even inspire. But it can do so only to the extent that humans are determined to use it towards those ends. Otherwise, it is merely wires and lights in a box. Good night, and good luck.
And so when I listen to that, I think the very same thing of social media, of 24/7 cable news. We can illuminate, but we can also insulate. We can enlighten.
The Attorney General's list does not and never has listed the ACLU as subversive, nor does the FBI or any other federal government agency. And the American Civil Liberties Union hold.
Here's the challenge with trying to do all the technology at once from home. And so thanks for bearing with me with that. But as I was saying, this is the challenge. So with every advancement in technology, it changes how we get our information, and it changes deeply how we use it, how we access it, and how we filter it. And that's an important thing to think of. These instruments and the news itself is just as dependent upon us. And so for our ability to be news literate, we have to really understand how we got to where we are and how we use it. So the civil rights also showed how the press could absolutely transform the thinking of a nation. And I pull this up because it didn't necessarily just start with the Montgomery bus boycott. It actually started with the murder of Emmett Till, and his mother's insistence that the Chicago Defender, the Black newspaper, absolutely show what was done to her son's body, so that it coalesced an idea around the plight of the Black people in America, not just in the South, but all over the place. But more importantly, in the South, where the social norms were different. And much of the press, especially those local newspapers, were supportive of Jim Crow, or at least moderate on issues of desegregation. So you had the murder of Emmett Till, you had the Montgomery bus boycott, you had Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, you had Central High, Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957, the Freedom Rides, the assassination of Medgar Evers in Jackson, Mississippi on June 12th, 1963. Something to realize then, it was the same night that President Kennedy delivered his speech on civil rights and his intention that there would be a civil rights bill presented to Congress that year, that the assassination of Medgar Evers happened. You had the March on Washington. Then you had the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. You had the 1964 Civil Rights Act. You had the 1965 Voting Rights. All of these were around the personalities and the people and the struggle. And this is actually how a lot of television news ultimately legitimized itself as not just for entertainment, but for actually addressing serious issues. In fact, it's seen that the coverage of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy in November 1963 was specifically the turning point for news. That there had been this thing in 1954 with Edward R. Murrow covering McCarthy. But again, what kind of led was Ed Sullivan's Sid Caesar shows, Milton Berle, and the almost 24-hour coverage for 3 and 4 solid days in 1963 by especially CBS News, with Walter Cronkite sort of ascending to the anchor position after Morrow left the network. This is seen as the time when television news has legitimized itself as worthy of the journalism profession. This is also when about 10% of the Southern newspapers broke with social norms and actually started in their editorials and in their coverage pushing for desegregation and for the Civil Rights Act to be passed. So again, you see this change in objectivity into somewhat activism, but in the necessity of getting the true story out there because for so long it had gone ignored. Then you have the Vietnam War on top of this. And this was, this actually is a huge turning point in news. At this time, Walter Cronkite was considered, I mean, so this is a journalist and an anchor of an evening news program was considered the most trusted man in America. When's the last time you could have said that about a journalist? During the Tet Offensive, he actually goes over to South Vietnam and with all of his objectivity and with all of his, I just want to find out the facts, comes back and does this long program on the Vietnam War and actually states to some extent that he's going to deliver his opinion. And the concept that a news anchor was taking off his reporter's hat and editorializing was unheard of at that point. And he said, it seems now more certain than ever that the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate. It is increasingly clear to this reporter that the only rational way out then will be to negotiate, not as victors, but as an honorable people who lived up to their pledge to defend democracy and did the best that they could. He's fair in how he delivers that, but what he saw on the ground was so divergent from what he was getting from the Johnson administration, et cetera, that all of a sudden, even President Johnson said, if I have lost Walter Cronkite, I have lost Middle America. And within a month, he has said the president was not going to pursue re-election, nor even accept the nomination should his party offer it. So this is huge. This is a sincere moment when network news had changed so much and had such impact on America. But again, we had 3 networks at that time. And so we could rely on those 3 networks a little more than what we can now. In fact, I challenge everyone, can you actually name who are the anchors of the evening news on the networks now? So this begins sort of news as activism. We have this increased adversarial position between the press and the government. Not only was Johnson famous for saying that things were fake news, boy, Nixon was real big on using the concept of fake news. There's the Pentagon Papers that get published, Watergate that brings down Nixon's presidency. Then the US Senate Church Committee between 1975 and 1976 actually uncovered that during the years after World War II and even up into the 1970s, that certain reporters all across the spectrum were actually paid to carry a party line. And sometimes the editors knew about it and sometimes they didn't. So this is a real blow to certain aspects of legitimacy of the journalism profession because they've not held up their commitment to the principles of objectivity and fairness. Then you have the last 20 years of the 20th century. There's a tremendous amount of deregulation and technology that's taking place, and it leads to where we are now with such fragmentation and so much less ability to discern fact from fiction. So out of Atlanta, CNN, the cable news network, debuts in 1980. So a man named Ted Turner, who grew up in advertising. His father made millions in advertising, and he inherited the father's business. And he understood technology really well, and he was looking at, and he owned superstations, which were the precursor to cable. So when cable starts growing in capacity, he launches CNN, 24/7 news. No longer do you have to wait for the evening news. No longer do you have to wait for the newspaper. We're going to keep you informed constantly. But the problem there is you have to fill 24 hours. So all of a sudden, you have what's considered personalities and pundits who are getting airtime. The same thing is happening when other channels, like all of a sudden I'm blanking, it's the 24/7 of Congress, C-SPAN. With C-SPAN, okay, watching laws get made. I mean, I don't know if y'all have heard the phrase, there's two things you never want to see made, and that's sausage and laws. Okay, so we're seeing sausage so get made, but also that's the celebritizing of the elected. And then the gutting of the fairness doctrine begins. Remember, before, since 1949, there has been this ethos that if you were going to present on controversial topics, you must present fair and equal balance both sides, if there are indeed two sides to it. Well, in 1985, under the Reagan administration, there are some challenges to this. And basically the fairness doctrine is gutted, it's vacated. It sits on the books, but it actually starts getting chipped away at, because there's this belief that regulating, remember the First Amendment talks about no law for a free press, for free speech. This is seen as as an affront to the concept of free speech. So it starts getting challenged in Supreme Court cases, and it gets chipped away at until it's no longer enforced. There's no enforcement of it. Then there's the introduction of mass market video cameras in 1985. So then all of a sudden, the equipment that is the purview of television broadcasters and movie makers is now in the hands of citizens. So citizens now have the ability to capture something on camera. Think of Rodney King and in LA, and how that snippet changed a city and ignited riots. So all of a sudden we have the concept of the citizen journalist emerging. Then you have the packaging of conservative talk radio, and it's built around about journalists, but about commentators and about personalities. And this is how this packaging of free conservative talk radio goes into the middle and to the heartland, where there's not cable, where there is not heavy communications and newspaper industries the way that there are, and people rely heavily on radio in those environments, different than the coasts. So in that flyover country, conservative talk radio takes over. And so personalities like Rush Limbaugh, who aren't bound by journalism standards, but because they have the legitimacy of a platform in which journalists have emerged, he has the weight of that behind him, even if he doesn't have the obligation of it behind him. He's a commentator, he's not a journalist, but because he's coming over the radio waves along with journalists, he has the legitimacy. He's given the legitimacy in the minds of listeners to that. Then Photoshop debuts. So this ability to alter the photography and the reality of what we're seeing becomes, even the most perfect women in the world get altered to be even more perfect than they already are. And so we actually see the rise of body dysmorphia along with Photoshop. The internet becomes publicly available in 1991. Huge game changer. And again, every single one of these advances in technology changes the economy of newspapers and chips away at the economy of newspapers and local news. So that stalwart of journalism and the standards of how you report actually is getting chipped away at, because the economy of it is getting chipped away at as these other things rise. And what you find too in news, television news, especially with the 24/7, the advent of 24/7 news and cable channels, is that to fill that, you need entertainment to draw readership, because again, there's more competition now. And now with the internet, there is even more competition. So how do you get viewership? How do you get the ratings that you need to draw the advertisers that you need to fund this? It becomes more about personality and not about expert. So you start having people moving out of the political realm into being commentators. And they're not necessarily bound by the same rules that journalists are. And so you see this real, but because they're given a platform in something that looks like journalism, all of a sudden you find that people are given legitimacy and a weight to what they have to say that's not always rooted in fact. Then you have, in 1996, under the Clinton administration, a chipping away at media cross-ownership. Until the 1970s, I believe, a single entity couldn't own both the newspaper, or they couldn't own the television station, the radio station, and the newspaper in a single market. Because what would happen is only a single voice would be communicating. So there was this real effort that you couldn't own more than 25% of a marketplace. And it had to be based on these calculations of viewers and all of these things. In 1996, that gets chipped away at, and it's gotten chipped away at to now media companies can own 45%, almost 50% of all of the media in a marketplace. So what you have now are situations where someone in California is listening to the same commentator as someone in Florida, and Florida has a different weather pattern than California. And so even to have someone locally who can speak to, oh, there's a hurricane coming, or we need to get emergency information out there, is diminished because these are national companies now. They're not local companies. And so you have media cross ownership that has just been gutted to the point that we're starting to get singularity of voice and not a balance of voice. So you've gotten the diminishment of the fairness doctrine. Now you have fewer owners of media that's out there. So now you have sort of this perfect storm happening. And then Fox News debuts in 1996, founded by Roger Ailes. Roger Ailes does not come out of newspapers. He doesn't come out of broadcast. He's a television producer. He is about entertainment, but he's also a political television producer. He was the architect of Nixon's 72 campaign. He was the architect of the Southern strategy on dividing people based on religion and race and economies. So someone wants to create a counterpoint to a CNN and sees an opportunity and create something called Fox News as the conservative counterpoint to what's considered the liberal bias in media and mainstream media, specifically the networks and the New York Times and the Washington Post. So you have something that comes in and again looks like 24/7 News and has legitimate journalists as part of its talent. But there's a real distinction between the legitimate journalists and who are the talent and who are there for entertainment. And then you see that effect on, because of the rise of Fox News, you see that effect then on CNN, then on MSNBC and its counterpoints, and then on network television. So the impacts of all of these things influence one another. And so we start getting these deeper polarizations. We start getting the need not to inform, but to entertain, and not to be fair and broaden our horizons and broaden the level of information that we're getting. But you start getting more insulated and narrow in the messages that are getting out there. Then you have cell phones with texting capacity in 1977, Google debuts in 1998, cell phones with cameras happened in 2000, Facebook debuts, and then Twitter debuts. So, okay, we have this tremendous amount of deregulation and technology all happening at the same time. And what we also have is our inability to catch up with it and understand the ramifications of it. So I don't have an answer to that. I'm just laying all this out so that we understand all the different things that affect how we get news and information now, and how it's changed our attention spans, and how it's changed our dialogue, and how it's changed how we cover stories. And while there's this great democratization to media and information, there's also this narrowing of the voices that are being heard, and there's no gatekeepers, especially when it comes to the internet and Facebook and Twitters. This is where your citizen journalism has taken over in a lot of ways. So the future of print journalism is completely unclear in this marketplace. And blogging has sort of taken over as a way of opinion becoming fact and taking the place of fact, when there's still not this rigorous fact finding and checking that goes on that would happen in normal reporting. There are hopeful signs online, and we're going to look at some of those. And there's hopeful things in print, and we're going to look at those too. But pardon me, there's a reason why I go through all of this history. Is because I really want us to think about this. I'm not indicting anybody, this or any particular platform. I'm just saying this is who we are, and this is how we got where we are. And we need to reorient our expectations to what we should demand and expect from the people who deliver news and information for us. That happens with us. That doesn't happen with anybody else. That happens with us. If we demand something different and we don't amplify the voices that aren't following what we need them to, well, then we need to make that known. And we need to get back to that concept of that journalism is about, and news should be about serving the governed, not the governors, and should be about representing the needs and interests of people, because that's who news is for. And so now that we're grounded in these differences between professional journalism, and we have to understand the difference between what's editorial and opinion and what's actual news. And that's another thing that's kind of gotten fuzzy in all of this, is news is governed by what you can see, the senses, what you can see, touch, taste, feel, hear, and verify. The challenge has been that with 24/7 news, it's sped up how often we have to get news out there. It has sped up and has diminished the time frame in which reporters can work on a story. And so if we could stop worrying so much about being first and getting it right, that might be something we could work on in our news literacy. So by understanding, how we're grounded in this and how we got here, I hope it helps us understand better the impact of the technology available to us and that impacts us, so that we can realize and what how the veil of legitimacy has impacted not just the traditional broadcast forms, and helps us and makes it harder for us to distinguish with accuracy what really is news. So the next class that we have, we're going to work on credibility. That's the very specific thing that we're going to talk about. How do you read like a journalist? How do you discern the difference between slant and misinformation, verifying news sources, spotting deep fakes. What really is fake news? What is libel versus slander? I see people mix that up all the time, and we've already talked about in today that, like, what really is libel? And it's not that, oh, someone gossiped about me. If it's true, it's not libel. What is propaganda? And how do we distinguish between slant and propaganda and misinformation? And how can anonymous sources actually be trustworthy? So that's what we're going to look at next week. And I really thank you for sort of bearing with me through this history, because I did that very specifically so that to be literate also means to be steeped in an understanding, a deeper understanding. And once we get to that deeper understanding, then we're able to say, okay, how do I want to address this? So I look forward to talking with y'all next week. And I'm delighted that y'all were with me today. And I hope you enjoyed this and that you'll come back, and that we will I'm sad that we're not in the same room and can't talk to each other, because I really would love for this to be a dialogue. But these are strange times that we're living in, and we'll figure this out. But I look forward to carrying on this conversation with you and talking with you next week. Thanks so much.